Welcome to the World War Archive, where we explore the untold stories and hidden currents that shaped our modern world. I'm your host, Jim Beaver, and today we're diving deep into World War II, not the battles you learned about in school, but the fascinating human dramas, strategic calculations, and unexpected consequences that continue to reverberate through our lives today. Picture this: it's 1945, and the world has just emerged from the most devastating conflict in human history. But this isn't just a story about victory parades and ticker tape celebrations. This is a story about three young men whose lives were forever changed by what they called the Typhoon of Steel, a story about corporate executives who turned soda into a weapon of war, about secret alliances that were betrayals waiting to happen, and about how the seeds of our modern world were planted in the rubble of bombed-out cities. From the boardrooms of Coca-Cola to the coal mines of America, from the strategic planning rooms where the Cold War was born to the laboratories where the computer age began, we'll uncover how World War II didn't just end, it transformed everything. These are the stories they don't teach in history class, the human moments that explain why our world looks the way it does today. So settle in, because we're about to explore how a security guard's observation could topple governments, how a soft drink became a military asset, and how the greatest alliance in history was built on mutual suspicion and carefully calculated betrayal. Looking to dive deep into the moments that shaped the modern world, the World War Archive on Skoob brings you gripping, high-impact podcasts that uncover the real stories behind the wars that defined a century. Powered by Skoob's AI-driven studio and over 100,000-plus minutes of premium audio, join a growing community of 50,000-plus listeners across the U.S. who are exploring history like never before. From the trenches of World War I to the turning points of World War II, go beyond the textbooks. Curious about secret World War strategies, the rise and fall of empires, the everyday decisions that changed history? The World War Archive has you covered. Follow and subscribe to the World War Archive for powerful episodes that bring history to life, one story at a time. Let's begin our story with the alliance of convenience, when enemies became friends. Before Pearl Harbor, before D-Day, before the world knew the names Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American strategists were already sketching the blueprint for a post-war world that would make the United States the undisputed global superpower. This wasn't just wishful thinking. This was cold, calculated planning on a scale that would have made Machiavelli proud. Prior to World War II, the United States was certainly prosperous. In fact, it boasted the world's most robust economy, but it wasn't yet the global hegemon we know today. American influence was largely confined to its own hemisphere, with some reach into the Pacific. But by the 1920s, something had shifted. American planners began envisioning what they called the Grand Area, a sphere of influence encompassing the Western Hemisphere, the former British Empire, and the Far East. Their objective was audacious: to curtail the exercise of sovereignty by any nation that might obstruct American interests. Then came the war, and with it, an uncomfortable reality. As it became clear that Soviet military forces would be the deciding factor in defeating Hitler's Reich, American planners expanded their Grand Area to include as much of Eurasia as feasible. But here's the fascinating part. They knew from the beginning that this alliance with the Soviet Union was temporary at best. During the war, Joseph Stalin became the endearing Uncle Joe to American propaganda. Roosevelt scholar Warren Kimball reveals that when military assessments made clear that only the Soviet Red Army could secure victory over Hitler in a land war, aiding the Soviet Union became Roosevelt's top priority. But this wasn't about friendship. It was about arithmetic. Roosevelt's strategy was brutally practical. Let the Soviets do the dying so Americans wouldn't have to. The numbers tell the story. For every American soldier who died in battle, roughly 60 Russian soldiers made the ultimate sacrifice. American aid accounted for about 10% of Russian war production. Significant, but hardly decisive. Roosevelt privately expressed that his goal was for the United States to act as the reserve force, while allies, particularly the Russians, conducted the majority of the fighting in Europe. But perhaps no one captured the cynical nature of this alliance better than Harry Truman, who would later become president. In the early stages of the war, Truman's perspective was brutally pragmatic. If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia, and if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany, and that way let them kill as many as possible. Political scientist Timothy Crawford describes this as a pivotal strategy to prolong war. Remarkably, despite this calculated approach, Truman genuinely liked Stalin as a person. He saw him as a likable and straightforward individual, comparing him to Tom Pendergast, the political boss who had helped launch Truman's career in Missouri. Truman continued to speak privately of Stalin as an honest and straightforward man, and as president felt confident he could work with him, provided that the United States got its way 85% of the time. The British, however, took an even more cynical view. From the beginning, they viewed the Western-Soviet alliance as a temporary aberration. By early 1944, British military intelligence had already identified the Soviets as the next likely adversary. They began withholding critical information about German forces from the Russians while obtaining detailed intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. British Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke harbored deep-seated animosity toward what he described as the semi-Asiatic race. He detested the Soviet Union just as fiercely as he did the Japanese, whom senior Foreign Office official Sir Alexander Cadogan referred to as little yellow dwarf slaves. By 1943, Brooke concluded that the USSR would inevitably become the primary post-war threat, advocating for the gradual strengthening of Germany and its integration into a Western European federation. The irony is breathtaking. While Soviet soldiers were dying by the millions to defeat fascism, their supposed allies were already planning to rearm Germany in preparation for the next war. By late 1944, British military strategy explicitly involved rearming Germany for a future conflict with the Soviet Union. This wasn't just British thinking. American intelligence had reached similar conclusions. Historian Richard Aldrich notes that both British Field Marshal Brooke and his deputy, General Henry Pownall, took grim satisfaction in the mutual destruction of Germany and Russia, the same Russia that was bleeding itself white to defeat Hitler. Such foresighted planning underscored the inherent mistrust between the wartime allies and highlighted a continuity in strategic thinking that found its roots even before World War II and would be adapted to meet the emerging geopolitical challenges of the Cold War era. The alliance that saved the world was built on mutual suspicion, calculated betrayal, and the cold arithmetic of global power. While the Americans and British were playing their double game with the Soviets in Europe, another drama was unfolding in the Pacific that would forever change the relationship between Britain and one of its most loyal dominions. This is the story of Singapore, how the supposed fortress became a symbol of imperial failure and colonial betrayal. For Australia, World War II was markedly different from the Great War. This time, the conflict came to their doorstep. Between the two world wars, Japan had significantly enhanced its military capabilities and launched an unannounced war against China, presenting a growing threat to Australia. Britain's response was to bolster defenses at Singapore, situated at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, approximately 4,000 miles from Australia. Australia had placed its faith in this distant British fortress and the British fleet positioned far away in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. But this faith was built on sand. Australia's own defense preparations were woefully inadequate. In 1930, the country had repealed the draft and created only a modest air force and navy, lacking aircraft carriers, battleships, or any major warships larger than light cruisers. When Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, Australia's Prime Minister immediately followed suit without consulting Parliament, declaring, "Great Britain has declared war, and as a result, Australia is also at war with Germany." Initially, like in World War I, Australia had no direct stake in the European conflict, but following tradition, they dispatched troops to fight in North Africa and Crete. As Japan's threat loomed larger, Australia requested the return of its troops to defend the homeland. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill attempted to allay Australian fears with grand assurances that the British fleet stationed at Singapore would protect Australia from any Japanese invasion. These promises would prove to be tragic lies. Japan's coordinated attacks began on December 7, 1941, targeting the US, Britain, Australia, and the Dutch East Indies simultaneously. Just 3 days later, on December 10th, Japanese bombers sank the only two significant British warships in the Far East, the Prince of Wales and Repulse, which were supposedly protecting Australia. The mighty British fleet that Churchill had promised would safeguard Australia was at the bottom of the South China Sea. But the worst was yet to come. On February 15, 1942, the British commander at Singapore surrendered to the Japanese, resulting in 100,000 British and Empire troops being captured, an unprecedented military defeat for Britain. Among those captured were 2,000 Australian soldiers who had arrived in Singapore in late January for what would prove to be a hopeless defense. For Australians, this wasn't just a military disaster, it was a profound betrayal. During the Japanese assault on Singapore, Australian Prime Minister John Curtin warned Churchill that abandoning Singapore would be an inexcusable betrayal given previous assurances of its impregnability. But Churchill had already made his choice: Europe first, the Empire second. With British naval protection eliminated, Japanese aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor turned their attention to Australia itself. On February 19, 1942, they bombed Darwin in the first of over 60 Japanese air raids on Australian soil, plus an attempted submarine attack on Sydney Harbour. The fall of Singapore was largely due to Britain's overextended military commitments across Europe and the Far East, coupled with the superior tactical abilities of the attacking Japanese forces. But for Australians, the strategic explanations mattered less than the emotional reality. They had been abandoned by the mother country in their hour of greatest need. The bitterness from this betrayal lingered for decades. Even 50 years later, in 1992, Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating harshly criticised Britain in a parliamentary speech, accusing Britain of abandoning Australia's defences, deserting the Malayan Peninsula and Singapore, and refusing to return Australian troops, leaving Australia vulnerable to Japanese domination. Keating's remarks reflected a deep-seated animosity toward Britain for its perceived betrayal during World War II, underscoring the lasting impact of these events on Australia's national psyche. The fall of Singapore didn't just mark the end of British military supremacy in the Pacific, it marked the end of Australia's naive faith in imperial protection and the beginning of a more independent, self-reliant national identity. This betrayal in the Pacific would have profound consequences for the post-war world order, as Australia would increasingly look to the United States rather than Britain for its security guarantees, a shift that continues to shape geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific region today. While the Western Allies were calculating how to use Soviet blood to win the war, the Soviet Union itself was facing an existential crisis that nearly destroyed the communist experiment before it could prove itself. This is the story of how a nation almost bled to death before finding the strength to turn the tide of history. On June 22, 1941, the Second World War irrevocably reached the Soviet Union when Adolf Hitler violated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact by launching Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Stalin had desperately tried to avoid this confrontation, and for good reason. The Soviet Union was catastrophically unprepared for war. The country was still reeling from the trauma of the 1930s. The Great Purge had not only instilled fear and suspicion among the populace, but had torn through the upper ranks of the military like a scythe. Experienced generals had been demoted, incarcerated, or executed on Stalin's paranoid orders. Despite the rigorous push for industrialization, the Soviet Union found itself facing the Wehrmacht with decimated leadership and inadequate preparation. The initial phases of the German invasion proved catastrophic beyond imagination. Nazi forces made unprecedented advances deep into Soviet territory, decimating significant portions of the Soviet military and capturing major industrial centers. The numbers are staggering. Within the first 6 months, Soviet casualties included over 800,000 troops killed, approximately 1.3 million wounded, and an additional 2.3 million captured by the enemy. This onslaught occurred against the backdrop of a nation already traumatized by a decade of state-led terror and repression. Defeatism and despair were widespread, particularly among those who had suffered from brutal collectivization policies and broader state violence. Many Soviet citizens saw the German invasion not as a threat to be resisted, but as potential liberation from Stalin's tyranny. Yet here's where the story takes a remarkable turn. The war that nearly destroyed the Soviet Union also transformed it in unexpected ways, particularly in regions far from the fighting. Central Asia, geographically removed from the war's primary theaters, experienced profound changes that would integrate it more fully into the Soviet framework than ever before. Central Asians, regardless of their backgrounds, were conscripted and fought alongside soldiers from all Soviet nationalities, fostering a sense of unity and integration within the Soviet state. This stood in stark contrast to World War I, when Tsarist attempts to involve Central Asia's indigenous population had incited the massive revolt of 1916, deepening the divide between Central Asia and the rest of the empire. Paradoxically, the war brought a form of liberation to Central Asia. The focus on the war effort diverted attention from rigid central controls, particularly regarding economic distribution, cotton production mandates, and the suppression of public discourse and religion, with German forces having seized control of 40% of the USSR's farmable land, ensuring food production became critical, leading to a drastic reduction in cotton cultivation. The Soviet state was forced to decentralize food distribution responsibilities, entrusting local entities to manage food supplies. This decentralization, while bringing significant hardships, also revived traditional practices that the Soviet regime had previously outlawed, such as community feasts marking significant life events in Muslim families. Security forces noted, often with consternation, the resurgence of such customs in areas like the Fergana Valley. Perhaps most importantly, the ideological rhetoric of the war began to shift. The earlier aspiration of building socialism in one country had aligned socialism with Soviet patriotism, but now the conflict was reframed as the Great Patriotic War. This new narrative emphasized the collective defense of the homeland by all the diverse peoples of the Soviet Union, fighting jointly to protect their common socialist state. The war rhetoric downplayed international proletarian solidarity, focusing instead on patriotic loyalty to the Soviet state and its people. Heroism and valor were defined by unwavering allegiance to the Soviet cause rather than communist ideology. This shift would have profound implications for the post-war Soviet Union, as nationalism became as important as socialism in defining Soviet identity. Despite the enormous casualties and initial disasters, the Soviet Union's exhaustive mobilization of resources ultimately steered the country toward victory. This daunting war effort significantly reshaped both the nation and the mindset of its citizens, creating a more unified but also more authoritarian state that would emerge as one of the two superpowers in the post-war world. The Great Patriotic War didn't just save the Soviet Union. It created the foundation for the Cold War empire that would dominate half the world for the next 4 decades. While generals were planning massive military operations and diplomats were crafting strategic alliances, one of the most fascinating battles of World War II was being fought in corporate boardrooms and government offices over something that might seem trivial: soft drinks. This is the story of how Coca-Cola transformed itself from a luxury beverage into a weapon of war, and in doing so, revolutionized both corporate strategy and military logistics. America's approach to soft drinks during wartime was radically different from other nations. While various countries curtailed the production of carbonated beverages to conserve resources, the United States opted to integrate soda into its military operations. Initially maintaining neutrality in the early phases of the war, by 1941, the growing inevitability of American participation caused considerable concern across various sectors, including commercial entities like Coca-Cola. Ben Ohlert, Coca-Cola's lobbyist stationed in Washington, D.C., was particularly anxious about the implications of war for the soft drink industry. War typically meant rationing of key resources, and sugar was paramount for soda production. Limited sugar supplies would directly translate to reduced Coca-Cola manufacturing. Ohlert recognized the necessity of developing a comprehensive strategy that would persuade government authorities to perceive carbonated soft drinks not as trivial commodities, but as indispensable elements of the war effort. His colleagues initially reacted with skepticism. They valued the brand's significance, but doubted the feasibility of convincing federal authorities about the essential wartime value of a sugary, fizzy beverage. How do you convince a government preparing for total war that Coca-Cola is a strategic necessity? The breakthrough came in spring 1941 when Eddie Gilmore, an American Associated Press reporter based in London, sent a pressing telegram to the company. Gilmore lamented the unavailability of Coca-Cola for American correspondents covering the Battle of Britain, describing it as a dire situation. This contact from a war correspondent who craved Coca-Cola amid active warfare provided unexpected validation for Eulert's strategy. Further reinforcement came through an order for 17,000 Coca-Cola bottles from the U.S. Army stationed in Iceland. The British had invaded and occupied Iceland to prevent Nazi appropriation, and the U.S. had subsequently taken over defending the island. The military's regard for Coca-Cola as a necessary supply backed the burgeoning campaign to align the brand with the war effort. By November 1941, enough momentum had gathered behind Eulert's vision to prompt James Farley, chairman of the Coca-Cola Export Corporation, to address the idea publicly. Farley was a heavyweight in political circles and former postmaster general under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. At the annual convention of the American Bottlers of Carbonated Beverages, Farley articulated a philosophy that would reshape how America thought about morale in warfare. Wars, according to Farley, were won not only with weapons but with morale-sustaining provisions such as beverages. Soda was far from a dispensable luxury. It constituted a critical component of maintaining civilian and military morale, a difference-maker between victory and defeat. Farley's compelling speech framed soda as a necessary morale booster and a potent aid to the war effort across military, naval, financial, and industrial fronts. When America entered the war, rationing measures immediately affected sugar supplies. Coca-Cola launched a vigorous campaign to convince the government to grant exceptions for carbonated beverages, emphasizing their morale-boosting properties. The company published pseudo-scientific studies promoting the idea that breaks with Coca-Cola could elevate production levels in munitions factories. Additionally, one of Coca-Cola's top executives secured a position within the War Production Board's Beverage and Tobacco Division, ensuring the company had a voice in significant policy decisions. Despite these efforts, Washington initially remained firm. Sugar rationing continued as planned, limiting supplies to 80% of 1940 levels and causing Coca-Cola supplies to diminish nationwide. It seemed like Eulert's grand strategy had failed. Then came the masterstroke. Company President Robert Woodruff delivered a surprising vow that would change everything. Coca-Cola would ensure that every American serviceman received a bottle of Coca-Cola for just 5 cents, regardless of where they were stationed or what it cost the company. This bold promise capitalized on a crucial loophole in sugar rationing policies. The restrictions targeted domestic consumption, not military provisions. The implementation of this strategy presented enormous logistical challenges. Bottling plants ramped up operations to meet increased demand from troops. The plant in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, saw production skyrocket from 100,000 bottles annually in 1940 to 750,000 bottles in 1944, driven by requirements of military personnel at Fort Knox. Sugar-laden ships left U.S. shores carrying Coca-Cola bottles destined for American troops worldwide, reaching distant battle zones like the Philippine island of Mindanao. There, resourceful soldiers repurposed emptied Coca-Cola bottles into Molotov cocktails to fend off Japanese advances, the ultimate transformation of a commercial product into a weapon of war. By September 1942, the provision of Coca-Cola to servicemen had been institutionalized within U.S. Army policy, with efforts extended globally. American military attachés advocated for Coca-Cola's distribution in strategically important regions like South Africa, facilitating transportation and supply to nearby stationed troops. The alliance between the U.S. military and Coca-Cola deepened dramatically in May 1943, following the Allied victory in North Africa, spearheaded by General Dwight Eisenhower. After the Axis retreat, Eisenhower inquired with his troops about their preferences for additional supplies. The resounding request was for more Coca-Cola. Demonstrating remarkable innovation, Eisenhower didn't merely request shipments of Coca-Cola. Instead, he asked for the establishment of 10 bottling plants across North Africa to ensure a continuous supply of the soda to front lines. Coca-Cola employees dispatched to construct and manage these plants were granted the status of technical observers, TOs, a unique rank equivalent to Army officers, ensuring they had the requisite authority and resources to fulfill their mission. In this manner, Coca-Cola's wartime strategy transitioned from a corporate gamble to a well-integrated military asset, symbolizing American ingenuity and embodying the spirit and morale of its people amidst global conflict. This unprecedented alignment of a commercial brand with a national cause underscored the potent blend of corporate strategy and patriotic fervor that characterized America's approach to World War II. Curious about the moments when power, strategy, and humanity collide, the World War Archive on Skoob goes beyond the battlefield to explore the leaders, decisions, and turning points that defined World War I and II. We don't just retell history, we unravel it, piece by piece. With over 100,000 minutes of expertly crafted audio and a dedicated community of 50,000-plus listeners, our AI-powered podcast studio brings the past into sharp, vivid focus. From secret missions and underground resistance networks to the rise and fall of empires, the World War Archive reveals the forces that shaped a generation and the world we live in today. Now, coming back to World War II, amidst the grand strategies and global movements we've been exploring, the war was also reshaping individual lives in ways that would determine the technological future of our world. This is the story of three young men whose wartime experiences would eventually help create the modern digital age: Akio Morita, Morris Chang, and Andy Grove. Their stories illustrate how the typhoon of steel that was World War II didn't just destroy, it planted the seeds of transformation. Akio Morita hailed from a well-to-do family of sake merchants in Japan and was on the brink of being sent to the front lines when fortune intervened. Instead of becoming cannon fodder, he was assigned to a Navy engineering lab. However, the war's brutality reached him nonetheless. American B-29 Superfortress bombers systematically decimated Japan's cities through relentless air raids, while an American blockade led to severe shortages and forced Japan into desperate straits. Morita's own brothers were being trained as kamikaze pilots when the war finally drew to a close. But Morita's wartime experience offered him something remarkable: a glimpse into the technological future. In the final months of the war, he had been engaged in developing heat-seeking missiles. Although Japan was nowhere near fielding a functional guided missile, this project gave Morita a preview of what lay ahead. It suggested that wars could be won by intelligent weapons capable of identifying targets and maneuvering autonomously, an idea that seemed almost like science fiction at the time. More intriguingly, Morita was vaguely aware of nascent developments in electronic computation, suggesting that machines might soon be able to think by solving mathematical problems like addition, multiplication, or finding square roots. This awareness would prove crucial in his post-war career. Across the East China Sea in China, Morris Chang's adolescence was marked by constant turmoil and displacement. Japanese armies advanced across China, causing him to relocate multiple times to Guangzhou, the British colony of Hong Kong, Chongqing, China's wartime capital, and eventually back to Shanghai following Japan's defeat. However, the chaos didn't end there. Communist guerrillas resumed their conflict to overthrow the Chinese government, forcing another displacement as Mao Zedong's forces closed in on Shanghai, sending Chiang fleeing back to Hong Kong. In Europe, Andy Grove, originally Andras Grof, endured his own typhoon of steel in Budapest. His Jewish family faced severe persecution under Hungary's far-right government, which treated Jews as second-class citizens despite drafting his father to fight alongside Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. His father was reported missing in action at the Battle of Stalingrad. The Nazi invasion of Budapest in 1944 brought further horror as Jews, including Grove's family, faced the threat of being sent to death camps. Grove witnessed the relentless artillery barrage when Red Army troops liberated Budapest, an act which brought its own terror, including the rape of his mother and the establishment of a Soviet puppet regime. These three young men were experiencing firsthand the industrial scale of World War II. Endless columns of tanks, waves of airplanes, and massive fleets delivering staggering amounts of military hardware. This was a war of industrial attrition, which the United States planned to win by leveraging its extensive manufacturing capabilities. Economists at the War Production Board in Washington identified success in terms of raw materials: copper, iron, rubber, oil, aluminum, and tin as the nation transformed its economic power into a military arsenal. The United States outproduced all Axis powers combined, manufacturing more tanks, ships, planes, and artillery. While battles took place at Stalingrad and Midway, the weapons that made these battles possible were manufactured in America's factories, including the famous Kaiser shipyards and assembly lines at River Rouge. The war's end came via radio broadcasts worldwide in 1945. In Tokyo, Akio Morita donned his full naval uniform to listen to Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech in solitude, avoiding any pressure to commit ritual suicide. Morris Chang, elated by Japan's defeat, quickly resumed a carefree teenage life filled with tennis, movies, and card games. In Hungary, Andy Grove and his mother emerged from their bomb shelter, only to endure further suffering under Soviet occupation. But the war had demonstrated the transformative potential of new technologies beyond mere industrial production. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki hinted at an atomic age that might overshadow an era defined by coal and steel. More subtly, the war had accelerated developments in computation that would prove even more revolutionary. The concept of computation wasn't new. Humans had counted with their fingers since prehistoric times, and the ancient Babylonians had invented the abacus. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, large bureaucracies created demand for human computers. Office workers equipped with pen, paper, and simple mechanical calculators capable of basic arithmetic operations. During the Great Depression, America's Works Progress Administration initiated the Mathematical Tables Project, providing employment for jobless office workers. Hundreds of human computers worked in a Manhattan building, calculating logarithms and exponential functions, producing 28 volumes of complex functions, including publications like Tables of Reciprocals of the Integers from 100,000 through 200,009, 201 pages of numerical tables. World War II dramatically accelerated the quest for computing power. Air forces developed mechanical bomb sights to improve bombing accuracy, allowing bomber crews to input parameters like wind speed and altitude via knobs that adjusted mechanical levers and mirrors to calculate angles and distances. However, real-world effectiveness was limited. Only 20% of American bombs dropped over Germany landed within 1,000 feet of their target. The need for more accurate computations pushed early computers to transition from mechanical to electrical components. Vacuum tubes became crucial in this evolution. Similar to light bulbs, these tubes could switch electric currents on and off, representing binary information, 1 if on, 0 if off, enabling varied computations via binary counting. Vacuum tubes also permitted reprogramming of digital computers. Unlike mechanical gears in bomb sights, which could perform only one type of calculation, vacuum tubes could be reconnected to run different calculations, marking a significant advancement in computational capability. However, vacuum tubes had serious drawbacks. They attracted insects, necessitating constant debugging, and frequently burned out, halting operations. ENIAC, a 1945 U.S. Army computer built at the University of Pennsylvania to calculate artillery trajectories, had around 18,000 tubes. On average, one tube failed every 2 days, requiring the daunting task of locating and replacing the malfunctioning component. Despite its speed in multiplying hundreds of numbers per second, ENIAC was massive, occupying an entire room. Such cumbersome and unreliable technology meant that vacuum tube computers were restricted to niche applications unless scientists could develop smaller, faster, and more reliable switches. This challenge would define the post-war technological landscape and provide opportunities for visionary individuals like Morita, Chang, and Grove to revolutionize the world. While Coca-Cola was conquering hearts and minds around the world, another transformation was quietly reshaping America's economic landscape. This is the story of how World War II's end triggered a revolutionary change in how America powered itself, a change that would have profound implications for labor, politics, and the very geography of American prosperity. When World War II concluded with Japan's surrender in August 1945, a significant amount of military and industrial equipment suddenly became obsolete, creating an enormous accumulation of war surplus. Among these assets were the Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines, originally constructed to transport oil during the war. These pipelines were shut down and designated as standby assets, sparking a vigorous debate among government bodies, oil industry leaders, and labor organizations about their optimal post-war use. Into this debate stepped Sidney A. Swensrud, an oil executive born in Iowa and a 1927 Harvard Business School graduate who served as an assistant to the president of Standard Oil Company of Ohio. Swensrud had a vision that was both simple and revolutionary: repurpose these pipelines to transport natural gas from gas-abundant Texas fields to the gas-deficient Northeast United States, which relied heavily on costly, coal-derived town gas for residential and industrial purposes. Swensrud articulated his proposal during a 1944 meeting of petroleum engineers in New York City, highlighting the perfect synergy of abundant natural gas supply in Texas, a large untapped market in the Northeast, and idle pipelines that could bridge the two. He estimated that around 15 million people could potentially benefit from this conversion. At the time, town gas was used primarily for cooking and hot water heating, with very few households using it for heating. Swensrud projected that about 500,000 existing homes in the Northeast could switch to natural gas, and with the anticipated post-war housing boom as veterans returned and settled, vast numbers of new houses could be equipped for natural gas, provided it was reasonably priced. Commercial enterprises, stores, offices, bakeries, hotels, and restaurants would also find natural gas appealing and efficient, offering superior heat value at lower cost compared to manufacturing town gas. The Big Inch Pipeline, spanning from Longview, Texas, and the Little Big Inch Pipeline from Beaumont, Texas, stretched over 1,200 miles across the United States. But this logical and economically sound proposal encountered fierce opposition from an unexpected source: organized labor. John L. Lewis, leader of the United Mine Workers of America, UMWA, emerged as the primary opponent of the pipeline conversion. Born to a Welsh coal miner in Iowa in 1880, Lewis possessed a powerful persona and was known for his persuasive oratory. Leading 600,000 United Mine Workers, Lewis saw the pipeline conversion as an existential threat to his members' livelihoods. Lewis had already established himself as a formidable adversary to President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed office after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death in April 1945. Lewis promptly initiated a strike following the removal of wage and price controls after the war, an action that did not endear him to the new president. Truman documented his challenging experience with Lewis in his presidential records. In spring 1946, despite previous agreements to continue negotiations without resorting to strikes, Lewis suddenly called for a coal strike. Faced with prolonged and contentious negotiations, Truman leveraged the Second War Powers Act to take control of the mines and facilitated a contract agreement by May 5, 1946. Yet Lewis wasn't finished. Apparently aiming to politically destabilize Truman before the congressional elections, he announced the termination of the contract effective November 1st, inciting another strike that lasted 17 days. Truman was forced to enforce stringent legal actions, ultimately compelling Lewis to relent. The irony of Lewis's opposition to natural gas was revealed when the Washington Post discovered that in 1945, Lewis had converted his own residence in Springfield, Illinois, from coal to natural gas, undermining his public opposition to the pipeline conversion. This revelation highlighted the cynical nature of his stance. He was willing to enjoy the benefits of cleaner, cheaper natural gas while denying those same benefits to millions of Americans to protect his union's interests. Lewis's late 1946 strike call provided significant momentum to proponents of converting the Inch pipelines for natural gas, emphasizing the potential to supplant unreliable coal with dependable natural gas wherever possible. The strike demonstrated the vulnerability of a coal-dependent energy system subject to labor disputes. Consequently, the U.S. House of Representatives convened hearings to deliberate on the pipeline's future. During these discussions, the Tennessee Gas Transmission Company temporarily leased the pipelines to supply gas to Appalachia, where a severe winter energy crisis loomed, providing a preview of the system's potential. Finally, on February 8, 1947, Texas Eastern Transmission Corporation secured the Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines with a successful bid of $143.1 million, merely $2.5 million shy of the original construction costs. These pipelines have operated continuously since then, transporting natural gas to the northeastern United States. By 1950, the United States' energy demands were met by three core fossil fuels: coal, petroleum, and natural gas, each contributing in varying proportions across the developed world. Though coal's dominance was waning, petroleum was becoming the primary energy source, while natural gas was making significant inroads into the global market. The immediate post-war period also marked the inception of nuclear fission as a new energy source, promising substantial potential yet shrouded in secrecy and limited to military applications. This energy transformation would have profound implications beyond mere convenience. The shift from coal to natural gas and oil would reshape American political geography, weaken the power of mining unions, and contribute to the decline of industrial regions while fueling the growth of the Sun Belt. The pipelines that carried Texas gas to northeastern homes were also carrying political and economic power from the coal fields of Appalachia to the oil fields of the Southwest. As the last shots of World War II echoed into silence, Americans might have expected a period of peace and prosperity. After all, they had defeated their adversaries, their heroes were returning home to ticker tape parades, the GI Bill was sending veterans to college, and the baby boom was beginning. The United States stood as the world's only nuclear superpower atop the global order, but this triumph would prove brief, and the reasons why reveal the harsh realities of international politics. By 1945, the United States had indeed achieved the global dominance that strategists had envisioned in their grand area planning. But before America could fully revel in its newfound position, circumstances rapidly deteriorated. The Soviet Red Army had taken control of significant portions of Eastern Europe and clearly intended to stay. Nations like Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria, recently freed from one tyrant, now found themselves under another oppressive regime. Pinpointing the exact beginning of the Cold War remains contentious among historians. Some staunch advocates argue it began as early as 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. For many, 1946 marks a significant starting point, when the Soviet Union showcased reluctance to maintain wartime cooperation, notably opting out of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Other historians favor 1947, a year that witnessed civil wars in Greece and Turkey driven by leftist insurgencies. The year 1947 proved pivotal when President Truman articulated his doctrine, pledging American support to nations resisting communist infiltration, thereby embroiling the United States in a perpetual state of proxy conflicts and covert operations on a global scale. This was the moment when the wartime alliance definitively transformed into the Cold War confrontation. Then there's 1948, often cited as crucial in Cold War history. High school and college curricula frequently highlight the Marshall Plan and the Berlin Airlift as pivotal victories for the United States during this early Cold War period. These actions were seen as significant wins, asserting Western resolve against communist expansion. However, beneath this triumphant narrative lies a more nuanced reality. The Berlin Airlift was necessitated by complete Soviet control over ground access routes to and from West Berlin, which was surrounded by the Red Army. The airlift was a desperate reaction to Soviet efforts to starve out the Allies. While the airlift succeeded, marking a tactical victory, it also exposed a profound strategic vulnerability that the Soviets would exploit throughout the Cold War era. Similarly, the Marshall Plan, an extensive American investment in Western European reconstruction, was driven by more than altruism. This program effectively re-established markets for American goods, transitioning the economy from wartime production back to consumer goods. More critically, it was a strategic maneuver to prevent Western Europe from gravitating toward communism. In countries like France and Italy, where communists had led substantial resistance efforts against the Nazis, devastated post-war economies presented fertile ground for political gains by leftist factions. The United States feared that without economic intervention, nations might democratically elect communist leadership, expanding Soviet influence in Europe without military action. 1949 marked a paradigm shift that sealed America's strategic concerns. In this year, the geopolitical terrain drastically altered as China, the world's most populous nation, succumbed to communism under Chairman Mao after defeating nationalist forces. In August, America's previously undisputed nuclear monopoly was shattered when the USSR tested Joe-1, a near replica of the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki, years earlier than American intelligence had anticipated. Within merely 4 years, an erstwhile ally in the battle against Nazism had evolved into a formidable existential threat to Western Europe and America's security. Regardless of where historians place the Cold War's onset, by 1948 the conflict's mechanisms were already in motion. Until this point, the Cold War had remained cold for Americans, though not for the Chinese. However, the outbreak of hostilities in June 1950 marked a stark transition. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, plunging the United States into active combat. Thousands of American soldiers were dying, and many high-ranking government officials suspected Soviet clandestine support for North Korean aggression. The Soviets were flagrantly defying the post-war global order that American planners had so carefully constructed. This audacity spurred fears of potential invasion of Western Europe, or worse, an attack on the United States itself. These apprehensions weren't limited to paranoid fringes, but were held by influential figures within the U.S. government who began hurriedly preparing for these dire possibilities. The irony was profound. The grand area that American strategists had envisioned, encompassing the Western Hemisphere, the former British Empire, and the Far East, was now threatened by the very ally whose sacrifices had made American global dominance possible. The Soviet Union, which had borne the brunt of defeating Nazi Germany, had emerged as America's primary adversary in the post-war world. This transformation revealed the fundamental contradiction in American wartime strategy. Roosevelt's plan to use Soviet blood to spare American lives had succeeded brilliantly in defeating Germany, but it had also created a rival powerful enough to challenge American hegemony. The alliance of convenience had produced exactly what American planners had feared: a competitor capable of contesting their vision of unquestioned global power. The Cold War wasn't just an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. It was the inevitable result of two superpowers competing for global dominance in a world where only one could be truly supreme. The seeds of this conflict had been planted in the very moment when American strategists decided to embrace Stalin as Uncle Joe while secretly planning for his eventual defeat. What does it take to change the course of history? The World War Archive on Skoob brings you face-to-face with the decisions, disasters, and acts of defiance that defined the deadliest conflict in human history. These aren't just stories. They're the echoes of lives lived on the edge of history. Powered by over 100,000 minutes of immersive audio and backed by a loyal community of 50,000-plus listeners, our AI-driven podcast studio brings the world wars to life with raw detail and powerful storytelling. From whispered intelligence in war rooms to the roar of tanks on the battlefield, every episode pulls you deeper into the war that reshaped the world. Follow and subscribe to the World War Archive, because to understand our future, we must uncover the truth about our past. As we reach the end of our journey through these hidden stories of World War II, we're left with a profound realization. The war that was supposed to end all wars didn't end anything. It transformed everything. The echoes of those transformative years continue to reverberate through our world today in ways both obvious and subtle. Consider the three young men whose stories we followed. Akio Morita would go on to co-found Sony, revolutionizing consumer electronics and helping to make Japan an economic superpower. Morris Chang would become the founder of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, creating the foundation for our modern digital economy. Andy Grove would help build Intel into the world's dominant computer chip manufacturer. These three individuals, shaped by the typhoon of steel, would literally architect the technological world we inhabit today. Their stories remind us that history isn't just about grand strategies and political movements. It's about individual human experiences that ripple outward to change the world. The boy who fled from bombing raids in Japan would revolutionize how we listen to music. The refugee who was displaced multiple times across wartime China would enable the smartphone revolution. The Holocaust survivor from Budapest would help create the microprocessors that power our digital age. But the war's legacy extends far beyond technology. The strategic calculations we explored, America's cynical use of Soviet blood to win the war, Britain's betrayal of Australia at Singapore, Coca-Cola's transformation from luxury to military necessity reveal how institutions adapt and evolve under pressure. They show us that the noble narratives we tell about the past often obscure more complex and sometimes disturbing realities. The energy transformation that followed the war, symbolized by the conversion of the Big Inch pipelines from oil to natural gas, illustrates how conflicts create unexpected opportunities. John L. Lewis's opposition to natural gas, even while using it in his own home, demonstrates the gap between public positions and private choices that continues to characterize political leadership today. Perhaps most significantly, the origins of the Cold War that we traced show us how alliances of convenience can become the foundations for future conflicts. The American strategy of playing allies against each other, the British planning to rearm Germany while still fighting alongside the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union's integration of diverse peoples into a unified war effort all reveal the pragmatic calculations that drive international relations. The fall of Singapore and Australia's sense of betrayal by Britain foreshadowed the decline of the British Empire and the rise of new power configurations in the Pacific. Today's debates about Australian-American cooperation versus Australian-Chinese economic ties echo the strategic dilemmas that emerged from wartime betrayal. Coca-Cola's wartime strategy, which seems almost comical in retrospect, actually pioneered the corporate military partnerships that characterize modern warfare. The company's success in convincing the government that soda was essential for morale established precedents for how private companies could embed themselves in military operations, a practice that continues with military contractors today. What emerges from these stories is a picture of World War II not as a simple struggle between good and evil, but as a complex transformation that created our modern world with all its contradictions and complications. The war didn't resolve the fundamental tensions between different visions of human organization. It simply shifted them to new arenas and gave them new forms. The Soviet Union that emerged from the war, traumatized but victorious, would carry both the memory of its great sacrifice and the paranoia born from that sacrifice into the Cold War. The United States, having achieved global dominance through careful manipulation of its allies, would find that dominance challenged by one of those very allies. The technological innovations born from wartime necessity would revolutionize civilian life in ways that the war's participants could never have imagined. Today, as we grapple with new global challenges, climate change, technological disruption, rising authoritarianism, and great power competition, the lessons of World War II remain remarkably relevant. They remind us that official narratives often obscure complex realities, that today's allies can become tomorrow's adversaries, that individual human experiences shape grand historical outcomes, and that technological change can have consequences far beyond their original intentions. The war that was supposed to make the world safe for democracy instead created a bipolar world locked in ideological struggle. The alliance that defeated fascism immediately began planning for the next conflict. The technological innovations that won the war would eventually create weapons capable of destroying civilization itself. But perhaps the most important lesson from these stories is that history is not inevitable. The choices made by individuals, from Frank Wills noticing a door ajar at Watergate to Ben Ohlert convincing the government that Coca-Cola was essential for morale, to Sidney Swensrud envisioning natural gas pipelines, shape the world in unpredictable ways. The echoes of World War II continue to reverberate through our world because the fundamental questions the war raised remain unanswered. How do we balance cooperation and competition between nations? How do we harness technological innovation for human benefit rather than destruction? How do we maintain democratic values while protecting security? How do we honor the sacrifices of the past while building a better future? These questions don't have easy answers, but they deserve our careful consideration. The men and women who lived through the typhoon of steel of World War II created the world we've inherited. Understanding their experiences, choices, and consequences doesn't just satisfy historical curiosity, it provides essential insights for navigating our own challenges. As we face an uncertain future, The stories of World War II remind us that ordinary individuals can shape extraordinary events, that institutions can adapt in unexpected ways, and that the consequences of our choices ripple forward through generations. The war may have ended in 1945, but its echoes continue to shape our world today. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the hidden stories of World War II. Until next time, remember that history is not just what happened, it's what continues to happen, shaped by the choices we make today in response to the echoes of yesterday.